The morning sun cast long shadows across the small suburban cemetery as family members began gathering around the freshly dug grave. Margaret Thompson clutched a tissue in her weathered hands, her eyes red from days of crying. Her husband of 52 years, Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, lay in the polished wooden casket before her, draped with the American flag he had served under during the Vietnam War. Robert had been a proud soldier, even decades after his service ended. Every morning, he would raise the flag in their front yard with the same precision he had learned in basic training. Every evening, he would carefully fold it and bring it inside, treating it with the reverence of something sacred. His military service had defined much of who he was, and even in his final years battling cancer, he would tell stories of his time overseas to anyone who would listen. The funeral service was small but meaningful. About 30 people attended, mostly family and a few neighbors who had grown to love the quiet veteran over the years. Robert's son David had driven in from 3 states away, and his daughter Lisa had flown in from California with her 2 young children. The grandchildren didn't fully understand what was happening, but they knew their grandfather had been special. He had always worn his old military cap when he took them fishing, and he would teach them how to properly respect the flag. Father Martinez, the local priest who had known Robert for 20 years, spoke about a man who had served his country with honor and his community with kindness. He mentioned how Robert had volunteered at the local food bank every Tuesday for the past 15 years, never missing a week unless he was in the hospital for treatments. The priest talked about Robert's gentle nature and how he had mentored several young men in the neighborhood, teaching them about responsibility and service. As the service concluded, the military honor guard prepared for the flag-folding ceremony. 2 soldiers in crisp dress uniforms approached the casket with practiced precision. Margaret watched through her tears as they began the careful process of folding the flag that had covered her husband's casket. Each fold was deliberate and meaningful, representing the values Robert had lived by throughout his life. The ceremony was going smoothly until Margaret noticed something that made her heart sink. Standing near the back of the small gathering was a man she didn't recognize, wearing an expensive suit and checking his phone repeatedly. He seemed completely disconnected from the solemn moment taking place. Next to him stood a woman with a clipboard, also dressed professionally but appearing impatient as she glanced at her watch. David noticed his mother's distressed expression and followed her gaze to the 2 strangers. He had seen them earlier, but assumed they were representatives from the funeral home or cemetery. Now, watching their behavior during this sacred moment, he felt a growing sense of unease. The man in the suit was actually taking pictures with his phone, which seemed completely inappropriate for a funeral service. As the honor guard completed the 13 folds of the flag, transforming it into the traditional triangle with only the blue field and stars visible, Margaret felt a brief moment of peace. This was exactly what Robert would have wanted. The lead soldier approached her with the folded flag, ready to present it to her with the traditional words of gratitude for her husband's service. But before the presentation could take place, the man in the expensive suit stepped forward and interrupted the ceremony. He announced himself as Mr. Harrison from the Department of Veterans Affairs and claimed there had been an administrative error regarding Robert's military records. According to his paperwork, he said, Robert Thompson was not entitled to military funeral honors or the flag presentation. The small gathering fell silent in shock. Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. David immediately stepped forward, demanding to see the documentation and asking for an explanation. How could there be an error about his father's military service? Robert had his discharge papers, his medals, and decades of evidence proving his honorable service in Vietnam. Mr. Harrison remained coldly professional as he explained that according to their recent audit of military records, there were discrepancies in Robert Thompson's service record that disqualified him from receiving full military honors. He stated that the flag needed to be confiscated as government property and that the honor guard ceremony should be discontinued immediately. The honor guard soldiers looked confused and uncomfortable. They had been briefed about Robert's service record and had seen no issues with providing the standard ceremony. The lead soldier, Sergeant Williams, had performed hundreds of these ceremonies and had never encountered such a situation. He looked between the family and the bureaucrat, unsure of how to proceed. Margaret began to sob as the reality of the situation hit her. Not only was she losing her husband, but now strangers were trying to take away the final symbol of his service and sacrifice, the flag that she had expected to treasure for the rest of her life, the flag that would have been displayed in their living room as a reminder of Robert's honor, was being taken away by people who had never known him. Lisa put her arm around her mother while David confronted Mr. Harrison more aggressively. The other family members and friends began to murmur angrily among themselves. This was supposed to be a time for grieving and remembering a good man, not for dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. The children, sensing the tension, began to cry, adding to the chaos of the moment. Mr. Harrison remained unmoved by the family's distress. He motioned to his assistant, who stepped forward with official-looking paperwork. They insisted that the flag had to be removed immediately and that any military honors had to cease. The cemetery director, who had been watching from a distance, approached nervously, unsure of his authority in such a situation. As Mr. Harrison reached for the carefully folded flag in the soldier's hands, Margaret felt a rage she had never experienced before. This wasn't just a piece of cloth to her. It represented everything her husband had stood for, everything he had sacrificed, and everything he had believed in. The thought of these strangers walking away with Robert's flag was unbearable. The tension in the cemetery was thick as family members, friends, and even some strangers who had stopped to pay their respects watched this unprecedented scene unfold. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone could feel that something was terribly wrong with this situation. Sergeant Williams, the lead honor guard soldier, felt his training conflicting with his instincts as he watched the scene unfold. In his 8 years of military service and 3 years performing funeral honors, he had never encountered anything like this. His orders were clear about following protocol, but everything about this situation felt wrong. The family's grief was real, and Robert Thompson's military records had been verified through proper channels before the ceremony was scheduled. Mr. Harrison extended his hand toward the folded flag, his expression remaining coldly professional, despite the obvious distress of everyone around him. "I understand this is difficult," he said in a tone that suggested he understood nothing at all. "But regulations are regulations. This flag is government property and cannot be presented due to the discrepancies we've discovered." Margaret looked up at Sergeant Williams with desperate eyes. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them take it." Robert earned that flag. He bled for it in Vietnam. He carried shrapnel in his leg for 50 years because of his service. How can they just take it away? The sergeant felt something stirred deep in his chest. He had joined the military partly because of stories his own grandfather had told him about World War II. Stories about honor and duty and standing up for what was right. Looking at this elderly woman whose husband had served his country faithfully, he couldn't reconcile taking away the one symbol of recognition she had been promised. David stepped closer to Mr. Harrison, his voice rising with anger. "I want to see your identification again. And I want to see these so-called discrepancies in my father's record. You can't just show up at a funeral and make claims like this without proper documentation." Mr. Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge and ID card, but he held them at a distance that made it difficult for anyone to read clearly. "As I explained, this is an official matter. The documentation is classified, but I can assure you that the decision is final." Something about the man's evasiveness troubled Sergeant Williams even more. In his experience, legitimate military officials were always transparent about their authority and willing to explain procedures clearly. This man seemed to be hiding something, and his assistant hadn't spoken a single word during the entire confrontation. Lisa, Robert's daughter, pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction. "If this is legitimate," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "then you won't mind being on camera while you explain exactly why you're taking a flag away from a widow at her husband's funeral." Mr. Harrison immediately became agitated when he noticed the phone. Camera pointed in his direction. "Recording is not permitted during official government business," he snapped. But Lisa continued filming. Several other family members also began taking out their phones, and word was spreading to other people in the cemetery who had stopped to watch the unusual scene. Father Martinez, who had been standing quietly during the confrontation, stepped forward. "I've been performing military funerals for 25 years, he said calmly but firmly. "I've never seen anything like this. If there are questions about Mr. Thompson's service record, surely they could be resolved after the funeral." allowing his family to grieve in peace. The priest's intervention seemed to give Sergeant Williams the courage he needed to act. Military protocol was important, but there were higher principles at stake. He had sworn an oath to protect and defend, and right now that meant protecting a grieving family from what appeared to be either a massive bureaucratic error or something even more sinister. "Sir," Sergeant Williams said, addressing Mr. Harrison directly, "I'm going to need to see your official orders for this confiscation. In my experience, the Department of Veterans Affairs doesn't operate this way. They send written notifications well in advance of any actions affecting military honors." Mr. Harrison's face flushed red. "Soldier, you don't have the authority to question my orders. Your job is to follow instructions, not to think." That statement was the final straw for Sergeant Williams. No legitimate military superior would ever tell a soldier not to think, especially in a situation involving potential misconduct. His training had always emphasized the importance of moral courage and the duty to question unlawful orders. The cemetery had begun to fill with more people as word spread about the confrontation. Some were visitors to other graves who had been drawn by the commotion, while others were staff members trying to understand what was happening. Several elderly men who appeared to be veterans themselves had gathered nearby, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and anger. Margaret noticed the growing crowd and felt embarrassed that her husband's funeral was turning into a spectacle. All she had wanted was a quiet, dignified ceremony to honor the man she had loved for over half a century. Instead, strangers were arguing over Robert's flag while his casket sat waiting to be lowered into the ground. Sergeant Williams made a decision that would change everything. Instead of handing the flag to Mr. Harrison, he took a step back and held it protectively against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "until I can verify these claims through proper military channels, this flag stays with the honor guard." Mr. Harrison's professional mask finally slipped completely. "Soldier, you are disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. This is insubordination, and you will face court-martial proceedings." But Sergeant Williams had noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Mr. Harrison had claimed to be from the Department of Veterans Affairs, which was a civilian agency, yet he was now claiming to be a superior military officer. The contradiction was obvious to anyone with military knowledge. "The VA is a civilian agency," Sergeant Williams said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You cannot be both a VA representative and a military officer giving me orders." "Your story doesn't add up," the crowd murmured as people began to understand that something was seriously wrong with the situation. David pulled out his own phone and began calling the real department, a Veterans Affairs office, to verify whether they had sent representatives to his father's funeral. Mr. Harrison realized his deception was unraveling. He grabbed his assistant's arm and began moving toward the parking area, but several of the gathered veterans blocked their path. These old soldiers might have been past their prime, but they weren't about to let anyone disrespect a fellow veteran's funeral. "You're not going anywhere until we get some real answers," called out one of the veterans, a man wearing a Korean War cap. "That woman deserves better than this nonsense." Sergeant Williams felt a surge of pride as he watched the community come together to protect Margaret and honor Robert's memory. This was what military service was really about, standing up for what was right and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The tension in the cemetery reached a breaking point as Mr. Harrison and his assistant found themselves surrounded by an increasingly angry crowd of veterans, family members, and concerned citizens. What had started as a quiet funeral service was now drawing attention from across the entire cemetery, with people abandoning their own visits to graves to see what was causing such a disturbance. David ended his phone call with a look of confusion and growing anger. "I just spoke to the regional VA office," he announced to the crowd. "They have no record of sending anyone to my father's funeral today. They said all questions about military records are handled through written correspondence, and they would never interrupt a funeral service." The revelation sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the gathering. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and bewilderment. If these people weren't really from the government, then who were they, and why were they trying to take Robert's flag? Sergeant Williams felt his suspicions confirmed, but now he faced a new dilemma. These people were clearly imposters of some kind, but he wasn't law enforcement. His authority was limited to military ceremonies, and he wasn't sure what legal steps could be taken against people who were essentially committing fraud at a funeral. Mr. Harrison realized his cover was blown, but instead of backing down, he became more aggressive. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, his voice rising. "There are multiple departments involved in veteran affairs, and sometimes communication breaks down between agencies. The fact remains that we have authority to investigate this matter." Lisa, still recording everything on her phone, stepped closer to the man. "If you're legitimate, then you won't mind waiting here while we call the police to verify your identity and authority. A real government official would welcome the chance to clear up any confusion." The suggestion of calling police made both Mr. Harrison and his assistant visibly nervous. They exchanged worried glances, and the assistant whispered something urgently in Mr. Harrison's ear. It was becoming clear to everyone present that these two had never expected their deception to be challenged so thoroughly. One of the elderly veterans in the crowd, a man named Frank who had served in Korea, stepped forward with his own phone in hand. "I'm calling the police right now," he announced. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but you picked the wrong funeral to mess with." Father Martinez, who had been observing the situation with growing concern, approached Margaret and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, "would you like me to ask everyone to step back so we can complete Robert's service? This disruption isn't what he would have wanted." Margaret looked around at all the people who had come to her defense, strangers who didn't even know Robert but were willing to stand up for what was right. She was overwhelmed by their support, but the priest was correct. Robert would have wanted his funeral to be dignified and peaceful, not turned into a confrontation. "Yes, please," she whispered. "I just want to say goodbye to my husband." Sergeant Williams heard Margaret's request and made another decision that would be remembered by everyone present. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd with the clear, authoritative voice he had learned in military training. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery, "we're going to complete this ceremony properly. These two individuals," he gestured toward Mr. Harrison and his assistant, "can explain themselves to the police when they arrive. Right now we're going to honor Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson the way he deserved to be honored." The crowd began to part, creating a respectful space around the gravesite once again, but they didn't disperse entirely. The veterans, family members, and concerned citizens formed a protective circle around the immediate area, making it clear that any further interruptions would not be tolerated. Mr. Harrison made one last desperate attempt to assert his authority. "This ceremony cannot continue without proper verification of the deceased's military status," he called out. But his words fell on deaf ears. No one was listening to him anymore, and several people were now openly laughing at his continued attempts at deception. Frank approached Mr. Harrison with his phone in hand. "The police are on their way," he said with satisfaction. "They're very interested in talking to people who impersonate government officials at funerals." Apparently that's several different types of crimes rolled into one. The color drained from Mr. Harrison's face as he realized the serious legal trouble he was now facing. What had started as some kind of scheme to steal a veteran's flag was now going to result in criminal charges. His assistant looked ready to run, but there were too many people watching for either of them to escape unnoticed. Sergeant Williams returned his attention to Margaret and the reason they were all there. With renewed purpose, he approached her with the carefully folded flag and began the traditional presentation ceremony that had been so rudely interrupted. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect and emotion, "on behalf of the President of the United States, the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your husband's honorable and faithful service." Margaret accepted the flag with trembling hands, holding it against her heart as tears flowed down her cheeks. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the final honor for the man who had given so much of himself in service to his country. The flag felt heavier than she had expected, weighted with the significance of what it represented. The crowd watched in respectful silence as Margaret clutched the flag. Many people were wiping away their own tears, moved by the dignity of the moment and the injustice that had almost prevented it from happening. The contrast between this sacred ceremony and the earlier disruption made the honor even more meaningful. David and Lisa stood on either side of their mother, providing support as she processed both her grief and the overwhelming events of the day. Their children, Robert's grandchildren, watched with wide eyes as they began to understand that their grandfather had been someone very special, someone worth fighting for. As the flag presentation concluded, Father Martinez prepared to offer the final prayers for Robert's soul. But before he could begin, the sound of approaching sirens indicated that the police were arriving to deal with the two imposters who had tried to disrupt the service. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The people who had tried to steal honor from a veteran were about to face justice, while the veteran himself was finally receiving the recognition he had earned through his service and sacrifice. Two police cruisers pulled into the cemetery with their lights flashing, but sirens turned off out of respect for the funeral service. Officers Martinez and Johnson emerged from their vehicles and quickly assessed the unusual scene before them. They had responded to many calls at the cemetery over the years, usually involving vandalism or disputes over burial plots, but never anything involving alleged government impersonation at a funeral. Mr. Harrison and his assistant stood frozen as the officers approached. Their earlier confidence completely evaporated. The assistant, a woman in her 30s who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up with panic in her voice. "This is all a mistake," she said to anyone who would listen. "We were just doing our job." Officer Martinez, a veteran himself who immediately understood the significance of what had transpired, approached Frank, the Korean War veteran who had called for help.
"Sir, can you explain what's been happening here?"
Frank, still angry but trying to remain respectful during the ongoing funeral, gave a clear and concise account of the events. He explained how the two strangers had interrupted the flag ceremony, claimed government authority they didn't possess, and attempted to confiscate the flag from a grieving widow. While Frank spoke, Officer Johnson interviewed several other witnesses, including Sergeant Williams, who provided a military perspective on the unusual nature of the impostors' claims. The sergeant explained that legitimate military and VA procedures would never involve interrupting a funeral service or taking a flag without proper documentation and advance notice. Margaret, still holding Robert's flag close to her chest, watched the police interviews with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The adrenaline from the confrontation was wearing off, leaving her feeling drained and emotionally overwhelmed. All she had wanted was to honor her husband's memory, and instead she had been thrust into a bizarre situation that still didn't make complete sense. Father Martinez approached Officer Martinez and quietly suggested that the immediate police business be conducted away from the gravesite so that the funeral service could be completed. The priest pointed out that there were still prayers to be said and a burial to be finished, and the family deserved to have closure without further disruption. Officer Martinez nodded in understanding and began guiding Mr. Harrison and his assistant toward the police vehicles for questioning. But as they walked away from the crowd, Mr. Harrison made one final desperate statement that explained everything. "You don't understand," he called out, his voice carrying back to the gathering. "The flag was supposed to be destroyed. The whole military record was supposed to be erased." His assistant immediately tried to stop him from talking further, but the damage was done. Everyone heard his admission, and the implications were shocking. This wasn't just a random scam or mistaken identity case. Someone had deliberately targeted Robert Thompson's military legacy for reasons that were still unclear. Sergeant Williams felt a chill run down his spine as he processed what he had just heard. The idea that someone would want to erase a veteran's service record and destroy the flag honoring that service was almost incomprehensible. It suggested a level of malice and planning that went far beyond simple fraud. David immediately approached Officer Martinez with urgent concern in his voice. "Did you hear what he just said? This wasn't random. Someone specifically targeted my father. We need to know why." Officer Johnson was already on his radio, calling for additional support and requesting that detectives be assigned to what was clearly a more complex case than initially apparent. The admission about destroying records and flags suggested possible conspiracy charges and raised questions about whether other veterans had been similarly targeted. As the police began their formal investigation, Father Martinez gently guided the family back toward the gravesite to complete the burial service. The crowd of supporters began to disperse slightly, giving the family more privacy while still maintaining a respectful presence to ensure no further disruptions occurred. Margaret looked down at the flag in her arms and felt a new appreciation for what it represented. Not only was it a symbol of Robert's service and sacrifice, but it had become a symbol of community support and the willingness of strangers to stand up for what was right. The flag felt like more than just cloth and stars now. It felt like a connection to something larger than herself. Lisa put her arm around her mother's shoulders as Father Martinez began the final prayers. "Dad would be proud," she whispered. "He always said that the military was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Today, people protected him. The burial proceeded with the dignity and solemnity that Robert deserved. The honor guard fired a 3-volley salute that echoed across the cemetery, and a bugler played taps with perfect precision. Margaret felt a sense of peace settling over her as her husband was finally laid to rest with the full honors he had earned. But even as the ceremony concluded, questions lingered about the attempted deception. Who had sent Mr. Harrison and his assistant? Why had they targeted Robert specifically? And how many other veterans might have been affected by similar schemes? Sergeant Williams approached Margaret before leaving and handed her his business card. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "if you need anything related to your husband's military records or benefits, please don't hesitate to contact me. What happened here today should never happen to any military family." Officer Martinez returned to the group as the burial service concluded. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, "we're going to need a statement from you about what happened today. The investigation is just beginning and we want to make sure we understand everything that occurred." Margaret nodded, understanding that her ordeal wasn't completely over. There would be questions to answer, forms to fill out, and possibly court appearances in the future. But she also felt a sense of determination. If Robert's case could help prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma, then she was willing to do whatever was necessary. The crowd began to disperse as the formal ceremonies ended, but many people approached Margaret to offer their support and contact information. The veterans especially wanted to make sure she knew that the military community would continue to watch out for her and help with any ongoing issues related to the case. Frank, the Korean War veteran who had called the police, shook Margaret's hand warmly. "Your husband served with honor," he said simply. Today proved that honor still means something to a lot of people. As Margaret prepared to leave the cemetery, she looked back at Robert's grave one more time. The ordeal had been traumatic and confusing, but it had also revealed something beautiful about human nature and community spirit. Robert would have been proud to see so many people willing to fight for what was right. 3 days after Robert's funeral, Detective Sarah Coleman sat in her office reviewing the most unusual case she had encountered in 15 years of law enforcement. The initial charges against Mr. Harrison and his assistant, whose real name turned out to be Jennifer Walsh, had evolved from simple impersonation to something much more serious and far-reaching. Harrison, whose actual name was Marcus Chen, had been surprisingly cooperative once he realized the extent of the legal trouble he was facing. During his interrogation, he revealed details about an operation that shocked everyone involved in the investigation. He and Walsh were part of a larger network that had been systematically targeting deceased veterans' families for months. The scheme was elaborate and cruel. The network would monitor obituaries and funeral announcements, specifically looking for veterans who had died recently. They would then show up at funeral services claiming government authority and confiscate flags, medals, and other military honors under false pretenses about record discrepancies or administrative errors. What made the scheme particularly despicable was what happened to the stolen items. According to Chen's confession, the flags and medals were being sold to private collectors who specialized in military memorabilia. Some items were even being sold online to people who wanted to display military honors they had never earned. The profits were substantial, as authentic funeral flags and service medals commanded high prices among certain collectors. Detective Coleman had contacted the FBI as soon as the scope of the operation became clear. The interstate nature of the crimes and the systematic targeting of military families made it a federal matter. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had been assigned to lead the expanded investigation. Agent Torres discovered that the network had successfully stolen items from at least 37 military funerals across 6 states over the past 8 months. The total value of stolen items exceeded $100,000, but the emotional damage to families was immeasurable. Many of the targeted families had been too overwhelmed by grief to fight back effectively, making Robert Thompson's funeral the first time the scheme had been exposed. Margaret Thompson sat in her living room, still processing everything she had learned about the investigation. The flag that she had fought so hard to keep was now displayed in a place of honor on her mantelpiece, but she couldn't look at it without thinking about all the other families who hadn't been as fortunate. David had taken time off work to help his mother deal with the legal proceedings and media attention that had followed the case. Local news stations had picked up the story, and it was spreading across social media as people expressed outrage about the targeting of military families during their most vulnerable moments. "Mom," David said as he brought her a cup of tea, Agent Torres called. "They've recovered flags and medals from storage units in 3 different states. They think they might be able to return some items to families, but they need help identifying which items belong to which veterans." Margaret felt a surge of hope, mixed with sadness. The idea that some families might get back their loved ones' honors was wonderful, but she knew that many families had probably given up hope of ever seeing their items again. The emotional trauma of having military honors stolen during a funeral would be difficult to overcome, even if the items were eventually returned. Sergeant Williams had stayed in contact with Margaret since the funeral, checking on her welfare and providing updates about the military's response to the case. The Army was conducting its own investigation to determine how the imposters had obtained enough information about funeral procedures to appear legitimate initially. The sergeant visited Margaret that afternoon to discuss a development that had emerged from the ongoing investigation. The military had discovered that someone within the funeral industry had been providing information about upcoming veteran funerals to the criminal network. This inside information had allowed the criminals to target specific services and arrive with enough details to initially appear credible. "Mrs. Thompson," Sergeant Williams explained, "the investigation has revealed that this was much more organized than we first thought. Someone was systematically providing information about veteran funerals, including details about the deceased's service record and family situation." Margaret felt a new wave of anger as she realized that people in positions of trust had been betraying grieving families for money. The funeral industry was supposed to help families during their most difficult times, not exploit them for criminal profit. The media attention had brought unexpected support from across the country. Veterans organizations were calling for stronger penalties for crimes targeting military families, and several congressmen had announced plans to introduce legislation specifically addressing the theft of military honors from funeral services. Father Martinez had also been affected by the revelation about the scope of the criminal network. As someone who had officiated at hundreds of military funerals over the years, he was haunted by the possibility that other services he had conducted might have been targeted successfully. He had begun reaching out to families from previous funerals to check on them and offer support. Lisa had flown back to California but was staying in close contact with the investigation. As someone who worked in law enforcement herself, she understood the importance of building a strong case that would result in significant prison sentences for everyone involved in the network. The FBI had traced the criminal organization to a group based in Nevada that had been operating various fraud schemes for several years. The targeting of military funerals was their most recent and profitable operation, but they had previously run scams involving fake charity collections and fraudulent insurance claims. Agent Torres discovered that the network had been planning to expand their operation significantly. They had researched funeral homes and cemeteries in 12 additional states and were preparing to recruit more people to pose as government officials. Robert Thompson's funeral had been intended as a test run for their expansion into the region. The investigation had also revealed the human cost of the successful thefts. Several families had been devastated by the loss of their loved ones' military honors. One elderly widow in Ohio had been so traumatized by having her husband's flag stolen that she had been hospitalized for depression. A young Marine's parents in Texas had spent their life savings hiring lawyers to try to recover their son's medals, only to be told that there was little chance of success. Margaret decided that she wanted to do something to help the other affected families. She contacted Agent Torres to volunteer as a victim advocate, offering to speak with other families who had been targeted by the network. Her experience of successfully fighting back against the criminals might provide hope and guidance to others who felt helpless. The agent welcomed Margaret's offer and arranged for her to speak with several families whose cases were part of the broader investigation. Margaret found that sharing her story helped her own healing process while providing comfort to others who had experienced similar trauma. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that Robert Thompson's funeral had been a turning point in exposing a much larger criminal enterprise. The courage shown by Sergeant Williams and the community members who had defended Margaret's right to her husband's flag had prevented dozens of other families from being victimized. 6 months after Robert Thompson's funeral, the federal courthouse in downtown was packed with veterans, family members, and supporters who had come to witness the sentencing hearing for Marcus Chen and the other members of his criminal network. The case had grown to include 8 defendants from 4 different states, making it one of the largest military honor theft prosecutions in recent history. Margaret Thompson sat in the front row, wearing a small pin with Robert's photograph and holding the same flag that had nearly been stolen from her. She had become an unexpected advocate for military families throughout the legal proceedings, speaking at congressional hearings and working with veterans, organizations to prevent similar crimes. The investigation had ultimately uncovered a network that had stolen military honors from more than 60 funerals across 8 states. The total value of stolen items exceeded $300,000, but prosecutors emphasized that the true damage couldn't be measured in money. They had torn apart the final moments families had to honor their loved ones' service and sacrifice. Sergeant Williams was also present for the sentencing, having been recognized by the Army for his courage in protecting the Thompson family and exposing the criminal network. His actions had earned him a commendation for moral courage and had led to new training protocols for honor guard personnel on how to handle unusual situations. During funeral services, Judge Patricia Henderson had presided over the entire case and had made it clear that she viewed the defendants' actions as particularly heinous. In her comments before sentencing, she noted that targeting families during their moments of greatest grief showed a level of callousness that demanded significant punishment. The defendants in this case didn't just steal flags and medals, Judge Henderson stated. They stole peace of mind from families who were already suffering the greatest loss of their lives. They violated the sacred trust that exists between our nation and the families of those who served. Marcus Chen received the harshest sentence of 12 years in federal prison, reflecting his role as the leader of the network and his involvement in personally stealing honors from over 20 funerals. His assistant, Jennifer Walsh, received 8 years for her participation and cooperation with the investigation. The other members of the network received sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement. Several had been funeral home employees who provided inside information about upcoming veteran services, betraying the trust placed in them by grieving families. Agent Torres had worked tirelessly to recover stolen items and return them to families whenever possible. Through raids on storage facilities in the homes of collectors who had purchased stolen military honors, they had recovered approximately 70% of the stolen items. The recovery process had been emotionally difficult, as many families had to relive the trauma of their original losses while reclaiming their loved ones' honors. Margaret had been asked to provide a victim impact statement during the sentencing hearing. She stood at the podium with quiet dignity, looking directly at Marcus Chen as she spoke about how his actions had affected her family and countless others. My husband Robert served his country with honor for 3 tours in Vietnam, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. He carried shrapnel in his leg for 50 years as a reminder of his sacrifice. When he died, all I wanted was to honor his service and say goodbye with dignity. Instead, you tried to steal the one symbol of recognition our nation provides to military families. She paused and looked around the courtroom at the many families who had been affected by the network's crimes. But your actions also revealed something beautiful about our community. They showed that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right, even for strangers. Sergeant Williams risked his career to protect our family. Veterans who didn't even know Robert came to our defense. Citizens recorded your crimes and called for help. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. You thought you could prey on grieving families because we would be too overwhelmed to fight back. You were wrong. Military families are stronger than you imagined, and we have a community that will protect us when we need it most. The courtroom was completely silent as Margaret concluded her statement. I hope that during your time in prison, you think about the families you hurt and the dishonor you brought to yourself, and I hope you learn that some things in life are sacred and should never be for sale. After the sentencing hearing, Margaret was surrounded by families who had been affected by the network's crimes. Many thanked her for her advocacy, and for giving them a voice during the legal proceedings. Several families had recovered their loved ones' military honors thanks to the investigation that began at Robert's funeral. Frank, the Korean War veteran who had called police during the original incident, approached Margaret with tears in his eyes. "Your husband would be proud," he said simply. "You've helped a lot of families get justice." The case had led to significant changes in how military funerals were conducted and protected. The Department of Veterans Affairs had implemented new verification procedures for anyone claiming government authority at funeral services. Funeral homes were required to report any unusual requests for information about veteran services, and Honor Guard personnel received additional training on identifying and responding to potential fraud. Sergeant Williams had been promoted and was now helping to train other Honor Guard members across the region. He had used his experience from Robert's funeral to develop protocols that would protect military families while ensuring that legitimate ceremonies could proceed without disruption. The story of Robert Thompson's funeral had also inspired a movement among veterans organizations to create support networks for military families during their time of loss. These networks provided advocates who could help families navigate complex military bureaucracy and watch for potential fraud. Margaret had established a small memorial fund in Robert's name that provided financial assistance to military families who had been victimized by crimes targeting their loved ones' service records or honors. The fund had already helped dozens of families recover stolen items and pay for legal assistance when needed. As Margaret left the courthouse that day, she reflected on how much her life had changed since Robert's funeral. She had never imagined becoming an advocate for military families or speaking at congressional hearings about protecting veterans' honors. But Robert's service had taught him about duty and standing up for others, and now she felt called to continue that mission in her own way. The flag that had nearly been stolen from her still held the place of honor in her living room, but it now represented more than just Robert's service. It had become a symbol of community, courage, and the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when faced with injustice. 2 years after Robert Thompson's funeral, Margaret stood before a gathering of over 300 people at the annual Veterans Day ceremony in the town square. She had been invited to speak about the importance of protecting military families and honoring those who served. The small town had embraced her as a local hero, and her advocacy work had brought national attention to their community. The memorial fund established in Robert's name had grown beyond anything Margaret had imagined possible. Donations had poured in from across the country, allowing the fund to assist over 200 military families who had been victimized by various crimes targeting veterans. The fund had also partnered with law enforcement agencies to provide training on recognizing and investigating fraud schemes that target military families. Sergeant Williams, now a staff sergeant, had been assigned to lead a new national task force focused on protecting military funeral ceremonies. His experience at Robert's funeral had made him a recognized expert on the subject, and he frequently traveled to train Honor Guard units and funeral directors about potential threats to military families during their time of grief. The immodest legislation inspired by Robert's case had passed both houses of Congress and been signed into law. The Military Family Protection Act created enhanced penalties for crimes targeting military families during funeral services and established a federal database to track such incidents. The law also provided funding for victim assistance programs and required better coordination between military and civilian law enforcement agencies. Margaret had received dozens of letters from families whose loved ones' military honors had been recovered thanks to the investigation that began at Robert's funeral. Each letter reminded her that their fight had been worthwhile and that Robert's legacy extended far beyond his military service. He had become a symbol of the ongoing battle to protect those who had protected their country. Detective Coleman had been promoted to lieutenant and now supervised a specialized unit that investigated crimes targeting veterans and their families. The success of the Thompson case had demonstrated the need for law enforcement officers who understood the unique challenges facing military families and the specific types of fraud schemes that targeted them. Father Martinez had become an advocate within the Catholic Church for better protection of military funeral services. He had worked with church leadership to develop guidelines for priests and other religious officials on how to identify and respond to potential fraud attempts during funeral services. His experience at Robert's funeral had taught him that religious leaders had a responsibility to protect families during their most vulnerable moments. The cemetery where Robert was buried had installed a memorial plaque recognizing him as the veteran whose funeral had exposed a national criminal network and led to justice for hundreds of military families. The plaque had become a destination for visitors who wanted to pay their respects to a man whose death had ultimately protected countless others. Agent Torres had been assigned to lead a new FBI unit focused on crimes targeting veterans and military families. The unit had investigated over 50 cases in its first year, recovering stolen military honors, exposing fraudulent charity schemes, and prosecuting individuals who impersonated military personnel for personal gain. The expertise developed during the Thompson case had proven invaluable in addressing a growing problem that had previously received little attention. Frank, the Korean War veteran who had called police during the original incident, had become Margaret's closest friend and support system. Despite their age difference, they had bonded over their shared experience and their commitment to helping other military families. Frank often accompanied Margaret to speaking engagements and helped coordinate the Memorial Fund's activities. Lisa had taken a leave of absence from her job in California to help her mother manage the growing demands of her advocacy work. She had been amazed to watch her mother transform from a quiet widow into a nationally recognized voice for military families. The strength Margaret had shown during the confrontation at the cemetery had blossomed into a lifelong mission to protect others. David had established a scholarship program in his father's name that provided financial assistance to children of military families who had been victims of crimes. The scholarship had already helped 30 young people attend college, creating a positive legacy that would continue for generations. Robert's service to his country was now inspiring service to others in ways he never could have imagined. The criminal network that had targeted Robert's funeral had been completely dismantled, with all members serving prison sentences. The investigation had revealed connections to other criminal organizations, leading to additional prosecutions and the recovery of stolen property worth millions of dollars. The ripple effects of exposing the network had protected countless families from becoming victims. Margaret often visited Robert's grave to update him on the progress of their work. She would sit beside his headstone and tell him about the families they had helped, the criminals who had been prosecuted, and the laws that had been changed. She knew that Robert would be proud of how his final service to his country had continued long after his death. As Margaret concluded her Veterans Day speech, she looked out at the crowd of veterans, family members, and supporters who had gathered to honor those who served. The American flag flew proudly above the ceremony, reminding everyone present of the values worth fighting for and protecting. "My husband Robert taught me that military service doesn't end when you take off the uniform," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "It continues in how we treat each other, how we protect the vulnerable, and how we stand up for what's right." Every person who defended our family at that cemetery was serving their country just as surely as any soldier on a battlefield. She paused and looked directly at Sergeant Williams, who was in attendance with his family. "Service means different things to different people, but it always involves putting others before yourself. It means standing up when it would be easier to stay quiet, and fighting when it would be simpler to surrender." Margaret held up a photograph of Robert in his military uniform, taken shortly before he deployed to Vietnam. Robert served his country for 3 tours in Vietnam, but his greatest service may have been teaching all of us that honor is worth defending, no matter the cost. His legacy lives on in every family we help, every criminal we prosecute, and every law we change to protect military families. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Margaret felt Robert's presence more strongly than she had since his death. She knew that their fight to protect military families would continue, and that Robert's flag would always represent not just his service, but the power of community and courage in the face of injustice. The story that began with an attempt to steal a veteran's flag had become a testament to the enduring bonds between those who serve and those who support them. Robert Thompson's final service to his country had protected hundreds of families and created a legacy that would honor military service for generations to come.